Hello and welcome everybody. In this tutorial we will be creating a simple Pomodoro app using plain JavaScript. Before we deep dive into the code, let's take a look at our final product. Here you can see we have 3 modes, a timer, some buttons to start, pause and skip, and some inputs to change the duration. We can switch modes, short break, long break and Pomodoro. We can start our timer with start button and pause it with pause button. We can also skip to the other mode with skip button, and we can change the durations. 35 minutes. Let's make the short break 15 minutes and long break 30 minutes, and they will change immediately. So let's start creating. Before starting, let's create a folder for our project and name it Pomodoro. I right click, new and folder, and I name it Pomodoro. Then we need to open this folder with VS Code. Here I will use VS Code, but you can use your favorite code editor. Then we will start with creating a HTML file. Index.html. I will use VS Code HTML5 snippet to start with. You can write all this manually or use VS Code snippet. I'll change the title to Pomodoro and save the file. And then we need to create a JavaScript and a CSS file. Let's start with the JavaScript file, pomodoro.js. We need to include it in our HTML or else our browser won't execute our JS file. So we go to the end of the body tag, create a script tag, and the source should be pomodoro.js. Then we create a CSS file, pomodoro.css. We also need to include it too. We need to include it in the head tag, like this. So let's start building our timer. First, we need to create a section for our timer inside the body, and we will type 25 minutes inside it. Our JavaScript code will change this value dynamically to show our user the current time left. Then we are going to create another section for controls and 3 buttons. One will be start and the others will be pause and skip. Let's head to our JavaScript and create base functions. Our first function will be start timer. We are not going to fill them yet. Pause timer and skip timer function. So whenever the user clicks one of these buttons, let's say start button, we want to call this function. So we will use onClick property and type start timer inside it. We need to do the same thing for other buttons too, but their functions are different. So this one will be pause timer and this one will be skip timer. So now we know that whenever the user clicks start button, the start timer function will be called. Let's start coding our logic. Let's start with start timer button. So before moving on, we need to learn about intervals in JavaScript. Let's start coding start timer. So we will use the function setInterval. This function takes a single function and some time in milliseconds. So since 1 second is 1000 milliseconds, we give it 1000 milliseconds so that the function 1 will be called every 1 second. Let's create a update timer button. And our interval will call this update timer function every second. We need a time variable defined globally. 25 times 60 because we need the time to be in seconds, but 25 is minutes, so we convert it to seconds. Every time the update timer gets called, it should print out the time and first decrease it by 1. So let's run our project and see if it works. We reload the page, hit the start button. Nothing is gonna change because we did not change the HTML. We are just changing this variable, but nothing is visible because we did not tell it to do so. But in console here, you can see that the value increases by 1 every second. And what we need to do is to convert these seconds to minutes and put the minutes in here and put what's left in here using JavaScript. But before that, we need to create the pause button to stop our interval from running. What we need to do is to open up this JavaScript file and get into the pause timer. So we need to use clear interval function, and it takes an interval object and stops it. But we don't have this set interval function's return value. It returns an object, but we don't assign it to a variable, so we are missing it. So we need to create a global variable named timer interval, an empty variable, and when the start timer function gets called, it sets the timer interval to the return value of set interval. And now our pause timer has something to clear and stop. So we use timer interval. And now our pause function will work too. We hit the start. It starts counting down. We hit the pause and it stops counting or decreasing. We hit the start again and it continues. Now we will update our HTML according to our time variable every time it changes. So let's jump to our code. We need to change update timer function. We first need to remove this console.log because we don't need it anymore. We first need to determine the time, the minutes included in our time variable. So it's in seconds, we need to convert it to minutes. We use math.floor time divided by 16. We did this because it removes the decimal points of a float number like 35.05. It removes the 0.05 and gives us a 34. We need to calculate the seconds too. Time mod 60. What this mod does is very simple and straightforward. As you know from math, let's say we have 125 seconds. We need to write it in this form. So 125 divided by 60 is 2. 2 times 60 is 120. And what we left here is 5. What mode does is it gives us this 5. So here we put 02, 2 minutes, and 05, 5 seconds. So we use time mode 60. We also need to add these zeros or it will look like this, 2 and 5, which doesn't make a sense because we need zeros to know that they are time left. So we do minutes is minutes. If minutes is smaller than 10, then add 0 to the minutes and else to the minutes. This might look complicated, but it is not. Simply, here is our condition. After the question mark, here is what should it return if the condition is true, and this is the else. We could have written it like this. If minutes is smaller than 10, then minutes is a 0 appended to the beginning, and if it is not, then minutes, we don't touch the minutes, so empty can be the else can be empty. These two lines of code are equal, but we will use this one since it is better. We will do the same to seconds, 10, and add a 0 to the beginning of it if it is smaller than 10, and else just don't touch it. So now we have here, for example, talking about 125, we get the 2, we get the number 2, and here we get the number 5, since we got the 2 numbers we need, and here we append zeros in the beginning of them. 5. Now we need to insert these things to our HTML here. So we use document.getElementById and type the ID of our element, which is timer, as we have specified right here. And we need to change the text content property and make it minutes plus this, and then seconds. Let's see if our code is working. Here you can see that it started counting down. We can pause it and we can keep running it. So this is how a timer works. Now we need to add more fancy stuff like modes, which will change the duration. But before that, I need to do one more thing. Create a reset timer function, because we will need it in the future, which will set the time 25 times 60 again. It will clear interval, so stop the timer. But before moving on, I need to add one more thing to reset timer. We need to call update timer function to see that the time has reset and the interval has stopped. And we go to our HTML file because we need to create modes. Div ID modes, and we create 3 buttons. The first one is Pomodoro mode, the next one is short break mode, and the other one is long break mode. We need to add data mode ID property to these. Property names starting with data can be accessible by JavaScript, like I could have typed data mode or something else here, and we would still be able to access it on JavaScript. So these are like variables. We give them IDs because we need to identify them. This one's ID is short mode, this one's ID is long mode. So now we need to call a function whenever the user clicks one of these buttons. But we can't use onClick because onClick has a downside. It's impossible to know which button is clicked using onClick, or I have had trouble with it. So I will show you the 2 ways of detecting clicks to buttons. We head to our JavaScript file, go to the beginning, and we use document.querySelectorAll. We will use a query in order to access these buttons. We have the modes, and when we want to fetch IDs, we use sharp symbol and we use modes. And inside modes, we need to fetch all the buttons. So we just straight up use button since they are button tags. And then we need to do for each. We need to call the for each function on them, which is a simple function. It's the document.querySelectorAll returns a collection, and this for each just creates a for loop over them, and it takes a function inside it. So it takes a function like this. We take the button as the argument, and we create a anonymous function with no name. People also like defining them like this. They are the same thing, but we will use this one. So here we have the button argument, and we do button.addEventListener, and the action is click. So we want a function to be called when the action click happened, and here we will give it a function, but we don't have that function yet, so we're going to define it. We will go with function handle mode buttons, and it takes an event, and then we need to, here in this function, we need to change modes, like using a switch mode function, which is something we don't have yet. So we create a switch mode function, and it will take a mode ID, one of the IDs here, and it will give it events.target.dataset.mode ID. This is the mode ID here. We access it using the dataset property, and we call the function switch mode with it, so that the switch mode function can know which action to trigger. So let's start coding switch mode. As you know, switch mode has 3 options. Pomodoro mode, ID is Pomodoro, short break ID is short, and long break ID is long. First of all, let's create a global variable that is gonna hold the current mode. So var current mode, and the switch mode will set that current mode to the mode, and its default value will be Pomodoro. And then after that, we need to reset timer. After this mode switch happens, we need to reset our timer because the time has changed. So for example, the Pomodoro mode is 25 minutes, and we switch to short break mode, and that will be 15 minutes, for example, and the timer should stop and reset. And here we will change reset timer, because let's first of all create a JSON called modes, which will, for example, the Pomodoro mode is 25, short break 5, long break 15. So now we have defined a custom JSON, to know how much minutes should we set the timer to in each mode. And then we will go to the reset timer and change this line of code. Instead, we will do modes, and inside the modes we will go to the current mode. So the current mode, as you know, will be Pomodoro, and this will give us the Pomodoro, the minutes that Pomodoro needs to have, and we multiply it with 60 to convert it to seconds. And now let's see if our code runs. As you can see, our buttons have added, but we have a error here. It says function 1 is not defined. I forgot to change this one to handle mode buttons. And we reload, start the timer, pause it, and go to short break, and as you can see, it changes. But since we call the update timer function, it decreases this value by 1, which results in having 24 and 59 seconds. We can solve this bug by adding this to end of the line. Then when going to long breaks or short breaks, it will stay the same. So now we need to create the skip buttons function. Let's head back to our code and create a new function called next mode. And we need to understand very simple thing. Let's open up Paint, and I'll show you what it is. So a Pomodoro session has 4 phases. The user, give me 1 more minute, please. So this is work, and this is short break. Work, short break, work and short break, work and long break. So as you can see, these are the breaks, and each 4 break we do a long break. So what can we do to calculate which one is the 4th one? We can create a counter global variable, and then we can use the mod operator and use the for, and this will give, and if this is equal to 0, which means it can be divided by 4, and this means we need to take a long break. So we simply start with if current mode is Pomodoro, but we also need to create the global variable. Let's call it total breaks, and we need to have it equal to 0. So if the current mode was Pomodoro, this means our user is gonna have a break. So we increased it by 1 first. And if total breaks mod 4 is equal to 0, this means we need to take a long break, and we switch to the long mode, and here we switch to the short mode since it's not the fourth one, and we can keep going with the short breaks. And if it is not in the Pomodoro mode, this means our user has already been in a break and he should get back to work. So we switch mode Pomodoro. And also we need to call this function in the end of this, just like this. If time is smaller than 0, smaller or equal than 0, sorry, we write it like this. This means time is up. We can create an alert and say time's up. Then we can switch to the next mode and reset. I mean, we don't need to reset because we use the switch mode function here, which is something that switch mode already does, so we don't need to reset the timer. We also need to call this function when the skip button is being pressed. So we are heading back to our application, starting the timer. As you can see, it works, and then we skip. It did not work. Let's see which error we had. Next timer is not defined, it says. It was next mode, not next timer. I'm sorry for this. So we skip, gives us a 5 minutes. We skip again, and it doesn't seem like it's doing the skip. We seem to have a simple bug here that I believe we can easily solve. Let me take a quick look at the code. The problem is simple. We forget a extra equal sign here, and then if we reload, it will simply work as we expected it to. This is a long break. Work, short break, work, short break, work, short break, work, and long break. Just what we wanted to have. So you might have just realized that when we hit the start button, it is still enabled and we can still press it, which will bug the program, cause problems, and it doesn't actually look good. So for example, when paused, you can pause a pause clock again. So start button should be enabled and this one should be disabled. And when running, the start button should be disabled and pause button should be enabled. So this is what we are going to do right now. First, we need to add some classes to all these. Just like this. We call them timer control start and timer control and start classes. We need to do the same thing on the pause too. So they have timer control class and start and pause classes. This one also needs to have the timer control. We are going to change these on CSS later. We are going to do enhancements. But for now, let's create a new function. Update control buttons. and it takes an argument called isRunning. So if the program is running, it changes the disable property of the buttons. So first we need to fetch the start button, document.query selector, and here we do timer control dot start. This selector, for classes, to fetch elements with classes, we use dots and the class, and without a space I put another dot and put another class name. This means the element should consider both of these. And I also fetch the pause button, document.query selector, and timer control.pause. So if is running, we simply start button should be disabled when it's running, and the pause button should be enabled, since so its disabled property is false, which means it will be enabled, and else is gonna be the exact opposite. Disabled is true. This code is very straightforward and easy to understand. Now you might ask, where are we going to use this code? Well, it's simple. We are going to use it in places that we changed the running property of. If when we start the clock or pause the clock. So when we start the clock, we need to update it to be true. And here it should be false because we've just paused it and it's not running. So the is running is false. And we can remove this. And what else is we also want to use it in reset timer. Update controls buttons false. And also I'd like to do another thing. We should pause the clock when we reach the 0. And when the time is up, it should go to next mode and also reset the clock. So let's see if our program is running as we expect it to. I hit the start, it starts running, I hit the pause, and you can see that it works very well. Let's add some visual enhancements to our application. We will add dynamic background color depending on the mode selected. So let's begin. We head to our CSS code and create some variables. We use the special roots tag to define variables, and the Pomodoro color should be AF3F3F. You can change these according to your likings. Short breaks should be 3FA 4AF, and long 703 AAF 3F. So, and then we will write some HTML CSS code. We want everything to be aligned in the center. We want our background color to be Pomodoro color first, since Pomodoro is the default. We want the text color to be white. We will use flex box, justify content center, so that the everything is vertically centered. Height should be 100%. Margin and padding should be 0, so that fits. Align items in the center. This is also a feature of flex. Flex direction column. We could have also did choose row here, but we want everything to be aligned vertically. And we then add transition, background color, 0.5 seconds with ease. This will animate the background color change. So now we need to head back to our JavaScript code. We go to switch mode. We will simply change the background color of our HTML property whenever the mode changes. So document.document element. This document element points out to HTML. Style background color is var, and the variables start with 2 mode and another parenthesis. And now let's see if our code works. We switch to short break mode, long break mode, and Pomodoro mode, and as you can see, it switches smoothly. Let's add some more CSS to our application. We head back to our CSS code and change the timer. Font size should be 140 pixels. Font weight should be bold, and the user select should be none, so that the user cannot select the timer with his cursor. I also want to add some style to these buttons, mode buttons, but they don't have any classes yet, so we need to add mode active. This active class is going to change the style according to depending on if the Pomodoro mode is active or not. So default is Pomodoro mode, so I added active class to it. We will remove and add this class on JavaScript later. So let's add some CSS to mode. Border should be none. Background color should be transparent. Cursor should be pointer. We add the border to only bottom, 1 pixel solid with RGB 220. Color, text color should be this RGB. Padding should be 15 pixels. Font size should be 17 pixels. Transition duration can be 2.2 seconds. I also added mode.active class to specify styles for active properties. Now I also add the hover property for active class so that the hover for mode doesn't affect it. You can see that they are the same. I also add mode.hover to specify what happens when we hover on the mode buttons. Let's add some style to our timer controllers, like here. They already have their classes available, so I do timer control. Border should be none. Background color white. And I filled the timer control up. We specify what will happen when the timer controls are disabled. Their background color should be RGB 26 again, and points. I also added their hover and disabled classes. So let's see how it looks. As you can see, they look nice, but we have some very little bug here, which happens because we forgot to add this little symbol here. And now you can see that it works very well. The only thing is these active classes doesn't change, so we will do them in JavaScript. So let's add active classes to these buttons on JavaScript dynamically. So first of all, when a mode switch has been made, we first want to remove active from all of these buttons because one of them has it and we need to remove it. So to do that, we do document.querySelector all and we do mode button, which will give us all the buttons here in a collection. So we create a for loop over them with a function taking lm, and in the lm we need to remove its active class. So you see, this will remove active from all of them. So now we need to find the button that is the modes button. So we do document.querySelector to find the button we need to add active class to. We will fetch it using button data mode ID is equal to our $sign and mode, and then class list dot add active. So it first fetches the button we need to add active class to, and it accesses class list and adds the class active. So let's see if it works. And as you can see, there is a bug in our program. Let's find it out. It looks like simply we have forgot to add the quotation mark here so that our fetch didn't work. So we reload, and now you can see that the tabs look changes whenever we click them and the active mode changes. Let's add one more feature to our update timer. We go to update timer, and what we want to do is to update this title whenever the time changes. So we come here, document that title is minutes and seconds, just like this. And then we do Pomodoro, and let's see if it works. Nothing happened right now because I didn't start the clock. I started, and as you can see, it changes. We have worked on a lot of features of this app, but we never take a look at what happens when the time clock runs out. So we can wait for 5 minutes, but instead we go to inspect console. This is also available in Chrome browsers, and we change the time, which is in seconds, to 5. So after 5 seconds, the clock will run. So as you can see, it says time's up, and it resets the clock and switches us to the next mode. We can play some sounds here. So to do that, I've downloaded a alarm sound from internet, and I'm dragging and dropping it into my project, and as you can see, it appeared here. So in JavaScript, to play audio, we do alarm sound is new audio alarm.wow. So we created this. Now we need to play it in update timer function. So basically, before we create the alert, we start playing the sound from sound.play, and after the user hits OK button, the next lines of code will run, and we will pause it, and we will set its current time to 0 so that it can start from the beginning when it the time runs out again. So let's see if it works. We reload the page, we go to short break, we go here, and we change the time to 5 and start. And as you can see, alarm plays. Let's add the form to our application for custom duration times. But first, we need to open our JavaScript code and add something. We go to the top of our file and create a constant variable called default modes, and they will be the same as the code above, and the long is 15. So what changes here is that our function will change these numbers, but when the form is empty, our code should know what were the default values, so it will use this to get the default values. And now we will add the handler function. Let's create a function named duration control handler. And leave it empty, and head to our CSS and add the form first. So we create a section called duration control at work time. Input type will be number, placeholder will be work duration, class will be duration, data duration ID will be Pomodoro, so that we can know which one is being tried to be changed. And we add the BR to go to a line break. We add 2 more and change their name to short break and long break. And change these to short break and long break. Then these will be short, this will be long, and we are done with our HTML. So let's get back to JavaScript. Whenever the user changes these values, we need a function that will be called. So to do that, we will simply do what we did right here. Query selector all and duration control input. For each function takes an input, and input dot add event listener. The action is change, and the function is duration control handler. And input dot value is should be 0, empty, because when we reload the page, we don't want the values to stay the same. We want to reset them. So this works for ones, and these work for ones too. They clear the inputs. So this function takes an event, and let's start coding. We first need to get the value. Our value is event.target.value, but we also need to call the trim method. This will remove the leading spaces in our input. For example, this will convert to this. And then we need to get the duration ID, event target dataset, duration ID. Just so you know, this is these values. And then we need to check if the value is valid. So it should not be empty, and it should be a number, and number.is integer, parse float number, so that we check if the number is float or integer. We need it to be integer. And parse int value is not equal to 0, and we also don't want times equal to 0 or it will create problems. So now we fill the inside of our if. Mode duration ID will give us the minutes, the current minutes, and we will change it to our parse integer value. And if the input value is not valid, which is the else case, mode duration ID should be default mode instead of what the user typed. Since it's invalid, we keep going with the default. And at the end, we also reset the timer because the minutes have changed and the timer should reset itself to adapt to that change. We also need to add some little CSS to make this work. Duration control, which is a section, margin top 20 pixels, and user select should be none. Duration controls, duration should have margin top be 5 pixels. We also don't want the WebKit outer spin button, and I'll explain what are these. WebKit inner spin. WebKit inner spin button. These are the buttons inside our number input. It adds these increment and decrement buttons, but we don't want them because they look bad. WebKit appearance none, and margin should be 0. And for Firefox, we do the same thing. Type number. We want it to look like a text field in Firefox. So let's see if our code works. As you can see, it has added some forms. Our timer works as we expect it to work. We can change modes. We can start the timer. We can pause the timer. Let's try changing its duration. Let's make it 35 minutes. You can see it changed. And if I type something wrong, it stays the same. For example, if I type 0, it still stays the same, which is something that was not expected to happen because we did a small mistake here. I called it with these symbols. Now we reload, we make it 35, and you can see that it changes. And if we type anything that is invalid, it rolls back to the default values. So we have reached the end of this course. We have learned how to use intervals, we have learned how to use datasets, and we have learned a lot of stuff about fundamentals of JavaScript. So for an exercise, you can create this application on your own, or you can come up with a new idea and try to build it with plain JavaScript.